toxin, so oftentimes it's from a pesticide, and it gets into the tissues of organisms and increases as we go higher in the food chain. So as our trophic level increases. So in this example, right here in the photo, we have some toxins that get into the water. So whether that's DDT, whether that's something else, some toxins got into the water. These phytoplankton, they absorb those toxins. Zooplankton will eat the phytoplankton. Just eating a couple of those plankton that have absorbed that toxin, it's not going to be bad. But the problem is, these guys have to eat a ton of the phytoplankton to survive, right? So that starts to build up. And so then we have a higher concentration of this toxin in the zooplankton, these guys. And so then we have this herring. It wants to eat a zooplankton. If it just eats one, it's probably not going to be bad. You know, it's not going to have a high concentration. But again, the problem is these guys are bigger and they're only getting 10% of the energy from these guys. So they have to eat a ton of the zooplankton to survive. So they get even more of that toxin. We move up again. The salmon eats the herring. These herring, they're starting to get pretty high concentration at this point, right? The salmon has to eat a ton of the herring. So that puts even more into the salmon, and then we continue down the food chain. Humans run into this problem too. So if there's been toxins in the water, and we want to go have some salmon for dinner, we have to be careful. There are some fish out there in some locations that we don't catch. We can't eat them because it would be dangerous because they have such high toxin levels. And so you need to be able to describe to me what biomagnification is. I'm not going to have you do any calculations with this, like calculating how much of the toxin would be in an animal. That's part of your extra credit assignment if you'd like to do that. But I do want you to be able to explain to me what it is and why we have higher concentrations as we go through the chain. Okay, the next thing we want to talk about, biodiversity. This is fairly straightforward. We're not going to spend a ton of time on this. Can someone give me a brief description of what biodiversity is? Can you point out something? What's biodiversity? Yep.
Life variety.
What?
Life variety.
Yep. So we break the word down right there. Bio means life. Diversity means variety. So the variety of life, right? So we can have a ton of different species of birds. That means we have a lot of biodiversity. We talk about diversity in human populations, right? We also talk about that in our ecosystem. So the variety of life on Earth, from genes to ecosystem. We can look at ecological processes, cultural processes. We want a lot of different things, and that's often beneficial. We don't have, in most ecosystems, enough biodiversity. It's beneficial, oftentimes, to have a bigger food chain, a bigger food web, more of those relationships. Looking here, this is great examples of biodiversity. Coral reefs, they have a ton. There's tons of different corals in here. We've got tons of different species of fish, of animals, that all work together to make a functioning ecosystem, and they do different jobs. However, are there any cases where too much biodiversity is a bad thing?
Yes.
Where?
I don't know.
Right, it can be. We don't normally think about that, right? Because the problem we run into nowadays is that we don't have enough, is that species are going extinct. But there are some where it can be a bad thing. With biomagnification, if you have a longer food chain, if you have more animals participating, you're going to see those biomagnification effects more, right? Does everyone understand that? So And in other cases, it's uncommon, but having too much biodiversity can destabilize ecosystems. When we talked about niches, like so a niche, an organism's job in an ecosystem, we can't have more than one that has the same job. But if we get, a huge amount of biodiversity, we kind of start to see some overlap there. That's not too great. Also, invasive species. If we were to add new species to an area, that does add biodiversity, but those organisms don't have a job in that ecosystem. So you guys did this before. I asked you to look up some examples of invasive species. Go ahead and do that again. Give me some examples of invasive species. Doesn't have to be in Indiana, it could be anywhere. And also, can you tell me what is an invasive species? So most of us have heard that term before, but I want a definition. Yeah? Plants? Do you have a specific plant? There certainly are some invasive plants. Or can you tell me what an invasive species is? Exactly. So anything, alive in the ecosystem that is not native to the area. So it's been brought over or it's come over from a different ecosystem. So if we took a fish from water. Yep. So if we took a fish from water, an ocean away, and we put it in a lake here, it doesn't have a job in our ecosystem. It's not going to go well. So can someone describe what's going on with the Asian carp? So what's happening there is the Asian carp don't belong, and they don't have natural predators, right? They've adapted to be in a different ecosystem. And so they're eating whatever they want, they're eating the other organisms, and they have nothing to control their population. They don't have those checks and balances in place. And so we're kind of seeing them take over and ruin that ecosystem. So when we're talking about invasive species, just like you guys said, it's an animal, plant, anything alive that is not native to the area, and they generally cause harm because they have not naturally adapted to belong. Awesome. All right, and that is the end of our slides for today. And so I believe we do not have